day, everyone, and welcome to Africa Rail. My name is Sudeshni, and I am the conference producer for the event. We'd like to thank all our sponsors and exhibitors for supporting our show. Please do enjoy the next session.
Good evening and good afternoon when you will be watching this at the Africa Rail Conference. My name is James Holly, and I am the CEO of a rail operations company based here in South Africa, but operating in 6 countries in the region, called Traction. I was approached by the conference to talk on dropping barriers to entry in our industry. And it's a really interesting topic, as you will see, as we go through the presentation, and really topical for the moment. And the main reason for that is we believe that the rail industry could be so much more. That with some really easy interventions, we can achieve a lot more in our industry. And it comes at an interesting time when the industry, particularly in South Africa, finds itself under some really significant duress. So what I'm going to be talking you through is the backgrounds, just some background and context to where the industry finds itself. We'll go through the methodology that we have taken to this presentation. We'll look at the different sectors and how the different barriers to entry impact the different sectors. Finally, we'll have a look at the summary of what barriers are impacting the industry most, because obviously some barriers that impact some sectors of our industry don't affect others. And finally, we come to some suggestions on what could be done. So firstly, background and context. The industry is under deep duress, and that's despite a rich heritage. The first trains ran in Cape Town in 1860, and that's 160 years ago. So we have a very long history, and during that time, we have installed 36,000 kilometers of track. Now, if that was to be replaced today, it would cost us about 1.5 trillion rand. So that 36,000 kilometers of installed track is in excess of 80% of the entire installed base of the African continent. And despite all of that, this incredible heritage, the industry today finds itself under deep duress. And it's important, I guess, that we sort of try and understand some of the reasons for that. If you look at Transnet, they moved 250 million tons in 2019. So by world standards, a very big operator, but only moved 17% of South Africa's general freight. And that 215 million tons was down 5% in 2019 from 2018. If you look at PRASA, they moved 645 million passenger journeys in 2008, 2009, and that is down to 208 million in 2018 and 2019, and of course zero during lockdown. We have found that there has been massive vandalism in our key metros over the COVID-19 period, which has effectively paralyzed the electric fleets in our key metros. We have found widespread liquidations and retrenchments in the industry due to the pullback on procurement, particularly out of those sort of very powerful and dominant SOEs. And then we found widespread corruption. The highly publicized and very heavily reported 1064 program, the public protector report into PRASA, the cancellation of the Swafambu rail leasing contract into locomotive supply to PRASA. In addition to that, there has been a policy over the last 10 years of insourcing of activities into the SOEs, which has reduced space for the private sector in certain sectors of our industry. So that then all together puts us in this position of deep duress. But there is this really exciting new era of structural reform that's coming through in the form of, firstly, the draft white paper to national rail policy, which is calling for a vertical separation of transit into infrastructure and operations, the introduction of a tracked access program in South Africa. We have the introduction of a single transport economic regulator, which is also seen as a precursor to track access in South Africa. And finally, the South African Economic Reconstruction and Recovery Plan that was the draft reported over the last recently is also calling for third-party access to the core network and the introduction of the track access regime into South Africa. So a really exciting new era that is coming. So then the methodology that we've applied to this presentation. Firstly, we've looked at we've taken a view that different barriers to entry apply to different rail sectors. So what we wanted to understand is what interventions will have the greatest impact. So what we did was we analyzed what traction, and bearing in mind this is our subjective view, what traction believes are the 10 key factors that are limiting new entrants and holding back investment. And then what we did was we said, well, if that's our subjective view of what are the 10 biggest factors that are causing barriers to entry, we took those and then we went out to industry and we did a series of interviews into industry and all of those different sectors of our industry. And then we used all of the outcome of all of those interviews to make some suggestions on what we could make meaningful differences to the industry. So we tried to take this from what otherwise would have been our, as I said, very subjective view into a more objective and well-represented view. So the 10 barriers that we've raised are corruption and irregular procurement. The second issue is unpredictable procurement patterns. An example of that is the procurement of 1,000 locomotives in 1 year, and then limited procurement for a number of years, no procurement for a number of years. We've looked at limiting contracting terms. Those are contracts through the SOEs that include clauses like as and when. An example of that would be when a company concludes a track maintenance agreement, so they have to be mobilized for that, but can only be called on as and when. It means you can conclude a contract for 24 months, but actually only physically work for 2 months. Short-term contracts is another example of limiting contracting terms. The returns policy, where you could supply 40 units if they aren't used, the company has the right to return, say, 20 of them. So that's limiting contract terms. The market dominance of transit and PRASO was raised as one of the issues. The high capital cost associated with our industry, $3.5 million a locomotive for a high quality locomotive, $100,000 for wagons, etc. The high cost of installing track, of course, as well. We raised the skills shortage as a barrier to entry. Limited access to funding. We're finding increasingly banks have got less and less access, or less and less interest in funding the rail industry. And the higher levels of regulation, and that applies to localization policies, the rail safety regulators, regulation that applies to the industry. We've looked at, we've asked questions whether the poor infrastructure quality is a barrier to entry, and that applies obviously on track infrastructure quality. It considers factors like the vandalism of and copper theft, impacts on signaling systems, etc. And then we've looked at the regulated restrictions. An example of regulated restrictions is Transnet being the owner of the infrastructure, being the only operator for freight on the core networks in South Africa. So that's obviously a regulated restriction. The industry subsectors we've looked at private operators, OEM'S, those are locomotive and wagon manufacturers. We've looked at part manufacturers, those are people that manufacture things like traction motors, for example. We've looked at track construction and maintenance contracts companies. Rail services companies, those are people that would maintain a traction motor, for example. And then we've looked at funders, those are debt funders, leasing companies, etc. And finally your consultants, consulting engineers, etc. So those are then our industry subsectors. And if you look at the barriers by sector, from an operator's point of view, regulated restrictions was the largest issue that the operators raised in terms of the barrier to entry. And that follows, of course. Private operators obviously don't have the right to operate on the mainline networks, which limits their ability to be an operator and invest in rolling stock and provide services into the South African market. The high capital cost was raised as a second issue, and very closely associated with that, of course, is your limited access to funding. So high capital cost, limited access to funding creates a massive barrier to entry. Poor infrastructure quality was raised as the next issue, and I think that is mostly related through the discussions we had to the recent vandalism in the sector, as opposed to the long-term quality of the network. And then finally, the high levels of regulation. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Regulation is very much required, particularly safety regulation. However, it does, of course, raise a barrier to entry, and so not necessarily a bad thing, but certainly it is a barrier to entry. The OEMs, that's your locomotive and wagon manufacturers, from their perspective, corruption and irregular procurement was by far and away the biggest barrier to entry, limiting them investing further into South Africa and expanding operations. The unpredictable nature of procurement, where they don't have a high degree of confidence that there will be ongoing procurement on an annual basis, also then undermines the confidence that they have to make investments into the South African market. And the high level of regulation they raised, interestingly, also as a high barrier, and that's specifically related to localization. The parts manufacturers, very similar to the OEMs, corruption and irregular procurement, again, number one. The second issue that they raised was this issue of high levels of regulation, again, flagging localization. Interesting, what came up here was a belief that localization legislation is being selectively applied, which was an interesting observation. The third issue is the market dominance of transit and PRASA, and that's really your counterparty exposure, where you've got exposure to one counterparty. It obviously raises your risks of doing business significantly and reduces the interest to invest into that sector. Unpredictable procurement was also raised as an issue. Track construction and maintenance, once again, corruption and irregular procurement was raised as the primary issue. High levels of regulation, again, interestingly, came up as a big issue. And then the third issue, again, was the market dominance of Transnet and PRASA. The rail services companies, they, interestingly, had the limiting contracting terms, the as and when clauses, short-term nature of contracts, and the returns policy. In their instance, in particular, it was as and when returns that they raised as a major issue. And in terms of barriers to entry and limiting the investments that they're making back into the sector. So that was their primary issue. The secondary issue was their counterparty exposure and the huge market dominance of Transnet and PRASA in the local industry. And then the third issue they raised was corruption and irregular procurement. The funders, some very interesting comments coming out of the funders. They found that corruption and irregular procurement was number one. Their reason was slightly different. The issue that they raised was if they were funding an asset that was supposed to be worth 100 Rand, for example, if it was procured at 125 Rand, it undermined, and they were funding at 125 Rand, it undermined the market value of the asset that they were taking recourse to, which then raises the risk of that funding. They also found that corruption and irregular procurement significantly undermines the confidence that they have to fund, particularly in light of some of the contracts having been reversed in the recent past. by court orders, etc. They also raised, and this is, we almost, we had a bit of a laugh about this, was the funders raised limited access to funding. The issue here is that these assets, locomotives and wagons in particular, are seen as dollar assets, and those dollar assets require dollar funding, and with the downgrades in the South African sovereign, that limited access to dollars undermines the bank's ability to fund in the local market, which was also an interesting concept. The limiting contract terms was also raised then as the third biggest issue, and that's because the banks just say with as and when short-term contracts, returns policies, they simply can't fund those contracts. Unpredictable procurement, they also raised as an issue, and they raised that unpredictable procurement on the basis that they aren't creating specialized teams within the banks, and that is because of the lumpy nature of the procurement. So they also raised that as an issue. The consultants, interesting that the consultants seem to be impacted by a lot more factors across the industry. It's almost like they're a catch-all and feel the issues that impact on the companies within the sector that they provide advice to. So from that perspective, I guess it's sort of interesting or understandable. But in their case, the unpredictable procurement was number one and corruption number two. So very similar to a number of other companies. Those two factors came off. First, market dominance of Transnet and PRASA once again also being raised as a major issue by the consultants and consulting engineers. So then if we look at the summary of what are the major issues then that are impacting on the industry as a whole, and corruption and irregular procurement are by far and away the biggest issue that seems to be creating a barrier to entry in the South African market, undermining confidence and taking away investment from the sector. The second biggest issue was unpredictable procurement. This issue of not being able to build a long-term business case around the South African market due to the unpredictable nature of procurement out of these heavily dominant SOEs. The next biggest issue was the market dominance of Transnet and PRASA, and then and together with that was the limiting contracting terms that are coming out of the SOEs, as we've explained those. The other issues to note: high capital costs was a big issue, and limited access to funding was another big issue that is causing the high barriers to entry, or perceived high barriers to entry in our industry at the moment. So then, having taken all of that under consideration, the issue, of course, is what do we believe we can do? So some interventions that off the base of those outcomes that we have, we believe would be extremely valuable for South Africa is of course firstly to eradicate corruption in SOE procurement. I think we're all aware of what a big issue that is, but it's amazing how every single time that just came up as the biggest issue in the South African industry. The second issue was we feel it's very important that in the SOEs they should take a holistic and industry view to procurement, and they should move away from some of those inverted commas bully clauses, your as and whens, the forcing contractors into very short-term contracts, and the returns policy. Those are all clauses which on the short term could be beneficial, and if you put yourselves in the shoes of the procuring entity, could be beneficial, but in the long term do seem to be significantly undermining industry. The next issue is this new dawn of allowing additional operators into the South African market seems to be something that is important, given the fact that the market dominant position of the SOEs was raised as such a big issue. In terms of the barriers to entry, is to bring that enabling legislation in on an urgent basis, and for government to accelerate their plans to do that. The implementation of the Luxembourg Rail Protocol is a very interesting one. The Luxembourg Rail Protocol, of course, is looking to make funding of movable assets and particular rail assets a lot more fundable, and making the rules common across various jurisdictions for protecting your security into assets. That seems like a complete no-brainer, and hopefully will assist with that barrier to entry of limited access to funding. We felt that legislation and regulation should be enforced consistently or scrapped, and that really again applies to localization, and perhaps a revision of localization post the 1064 program should also be considered. You know, the idea behind 1064, part of the idea behind 1064 was to create a manufacturing presence in South Africa, but that's certainly for locomotives, but that certainly hasn't been the case, with no other orders coming through at all post 1064, continentally or internationally, that we are aware of, or if there have been, it's been very, very limited. Another action is to implement tax and other incentives for local procurement instead of regulating it. Was another idea that we had. And finally, you know, the enabling basis of the rail industry in any country, and particularly in South Africa and regionally, has such knock-on benefits to upstream industry and general economic growth, that we felt that setting up a rail task team as part of the presidential infrastructure focus could be a really positive intervention for the industry. So that's the basis of that's really our presentation. Thank you very much for listening. I sincerely hope, and you know, we sincerely hope you found it interesting and took something from it. If there are any questions, of course, we'd be very happy to field them.
Wow, what a great session. Thank you all for joining. Please take the time to network and visit our exhibition hall. We'll see you soon for the next session.